Today we'll be looking at one of the oldest and most iconic Space Marine flyers, the Space Marine Thunderhawk Gunship. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. We've been looking through some of the Space Marine Forge World datasheets recently, so I thought it was high time that we had a quick look at the datasheets for the Thunderhawk, which of course is one of the most iconic Space Marine flyers that has been present in the background for absolutely ages. In this video we'll take a look at its datasheet, any obvious options, buffs or synergies that we could do with the Thunderhawk, and how I would run one myself on the field of battle. Now the Thunderhawk is a frankly enormous Forge World kit. It's certainly one of their more expensive ones. One Thunderhawk will set you back £475 if you want this colossal hunk of resin flying about your game boards, but I have to say it does look absolutely epic. And to be fair to it, if you're looking at pounds per point, then it's not quite as bad as a lot of the regular Games Workshop kits, to be honest, if you're looking to get a 2,000 point army together. In the background, the Thunderhawk is generally considered a linchpin unit for Space Marine chapters. It can deploy hardened warriors into the heart of battle, provide quick and brutal fire support, and even be equipped for bombing runs. The Thunderhawk was first developed in the later days of the Emperor's Great Crusade, and it was quickly adopted and mass-produced, to the point where every single legion had access to Thunderhawks, and when many of the legions were broken down into chapters, most chapters had several Thunderhawks at their disposal. So let's see what this mighty beast of war can do on the tabletop for us, when we include it in a Space Marine army. So the Thunderhawk is quite a pricey flying gunship, and one will set you back 1,448 points in its cheapest loadout. For that mighty price tag, you'll get a pretty impressive stat line, as you'd expect. The Thunderhawk has a movement of 20 to 50 inches, a weapon skill of 6+, ballistic skill 2+, strength 10, toughness 9, 30 wounds, 8 attacks, and a 3-up save. It is worth noting that the Thunderhawk does degrade fairly quickly compared with some other vehicles and Lords of War, however. It only retains its ballistic skill 2+ until it's taken just 7 wounds, when it will drop to 3, and then it will drop to ballistic skill 4, when it's only got 14 wounds left or less. The Thunderhawk is armed with a Thunderhawk heavy cannon, 4 twin heavy bolters, and 2 las cannons. It also has cluster bombs as well. So as you can see, a lot of its value is loaded up in that Thunderhawk heavy cannon, because frankly 4 twin heavy bolters and 2 las cannons isn't particularly impressive on a 1400 point chassis. That Thunderhawk heavy cannon has a 48-inch range, heavy 2d6 shots, strength 8, AP -2 and damage d6. So it's essentially an average of 7 crack missile shots per turn. Frankly, it's not amazingly impressive for the price tag that you're paying for the chassis. It has the option to replace this with a turbo laser destructor, which is free. It doesn't cost any more points than the Thunderhawk heavy cannon. This one's got a 96-inch range, it's heavy D3, strength 16, AP -4 and damage 2d6. And just as a small extra bonus, if you roll a wound roll of 6, then the target also takes D3 mortal wounds as well. Heavy D3 is quite unreliable for such a massive weapon, but on average, even without any buffs, the Thunderhawk should be getting around an average of 10 wounds through on a typical toughness 7 or 8 vehicle without an invul save with this. It's better against toughness 8 targets than the Thunderhawk heavy cannon, about the same versus toughness 7, and the Thunderhawk heavy cannon tends to outcompete it against a lot of other targets that are lighter or are multi-wound infantry due to it having more shots. I'd probably still choose the heavy cannon over this for the most part, though the turbo laser will certainly chew through big super heavies and heavy tanks just a little bit more efficiently. Those Thunderhawk cluster bombs give it the option to do a few mortal wounds. They're a once per battle device where a Thunderhawk gunship can make a bombing run over a single enemy unit that it's moved over during one of its movement phases. After it's moved, pick one unit that it's moved over and roll either 3d6 for every vehicle or monster in the unit, or 1d6 for every model in the unit up to a maximum of 12d6. For each roll of 5+, the unit suffers a mortal wound. So very depressingly, this will give you an average of 1 mortal wound against vehicles and monsters, and around 4 mortal wounds on an infantry unit that has 12 or more models in it. This is a little bit sad for a gunship as big and powerful as the Thunderhawk. Indeed, against a unit that's 10 models or more, you'd actually be better off with a Raven-Winged Dark Talon, as its stasis bomb will deal more mortal wounds, and the Raven-Winged Dark Talon costs less than 200 points. So not stellar damage output from those bombs. You can choose to switch them out for a Hellstrike battery, though this will cost you an extra 60 points and take you up to 1,508 points for the cost of the Thunderhawk. These are 72-inch range missiles with heavy 4, strength 8, AP -3 and damage 3. To be honest, in place of the cluster bombs, these seem like a perfectly reasonable pickup. They'll likely do far more damage than the cluster bombs ever would have done in one round of shooting, and of course they can fire on multiple turns if your Thunderhawk survives. So unfortunately fairly underwhelming firepower point for point, but let's take a look at all of its special rules. First of all, we of course have the Thunderhawk's transport capacity, and unlike most vehicles, it's really quite liberal in what sort of models it can transport. It can transport up to 30 infantry models, or each jump pack or Terminator takes up the space of 2 other infantry, and each Centurion takes the space of 3. It's quite cool to think that you could deliver 30 Battle Brothers into the heart of the action, or a whole ton of elite infantry. Interestingly, this thing can actually transport Primaris models, being one of the few things that actually has the option of choosing one or the other. It can transport up to 15 Primaris infantry models, but interestingly they say that it can't mix and match, so if you're transporting Primaris you can't transport any normal Marines, and vice versa. I can only assume that the two just don't get along in small confined spaces. As a massive super heavy aircraft, it's got a ton of rules to represent this. First of all, we have airborne. It can't charge and can only be charged by enemy units with the fly special rule, like normal flyers. It has the colossal flyer special rule, which is actually quite interesting in terms of targeting the Thunderhawk by enemy shooting and psychic powers. You always measure to the hull of the Thunderhawk, where it would be at tabletop level rather than in the air, but you add an additional 12 inches to the distance that the Thunderhawk is away from that model. So say if you were targeting it with a bolter that was right next to it, you'd be assumed to be outside 12 inches. This is quite interesting as it means that a lot of short-ranged weapons such as say plasma pistols or melter guns will never actually be able to shoot the Thunderhawk even if they're right next to it, presumably to represent it being fairly high up in the sky. It might also be a deciding factor as whether or not things like missile launchers and las cannons could hit the Thunderhawk. Potentially this thing could hover just inside 48 inches, open up against all enemies with its decent array of firepower, but be untargetable by 48-inch weapons, because you add 12 inches to the range of them. In addition, it also gets the -1 to hit rolls that flyers normally have via the hard to hit rule. Next we have supersonic. This is the standard rule that means it can only pivot 90 degrees before moving, and if it advances it goes an extra 20 inches. But we do have the hoverjet special rule, which means it can choose to waive this ability, have its movement reduced to 20 inches, but lose the benefits of airborne, colossal flyer and supersonic. Finally, we have void hardened hull, giving it a 5+ invul save to try and keep it a little bit safe from enemy return fire. Crash and burn, where when it dies, if it explodes on a 6, all units within 6 inches suffer 2d6 mortal wounds, so a potentially apocalyptic explosion there. Certainly could be worth a command reroll to try and make that happen if you're right next to some enemy key units. And finally, power of the machine spirit, which is the rule like the Storm Raven gets, to move and shoot with no penalty to its heavy weapon hit rolls. So overall, a massive, mobile, very points intensive unit, which has reasonable durability, but maybe not great durability point for point, reasonable firepower, but again not great point for point, but is very fast and has a large transport capacity and a bunch of interesting special rules. So let's have a talk about what we can do with it in terms of buffs and synergies. Firstly, you'd have to pick what chapter tactic you want this guy to have, but bear in mind that you're only going to get the benefit of chapter traits if it's actually in a detachment that isn't an auxiliary support or super heavy auxiliary detachment. This would likely mean a supreme command detachment, forcing you to invest in some more expensive HQs if you wanted to give it a chapter trait. Having said that, there's plenty of decent options. In particular, Iron Hands is a bit of a standout as normal. Having a 6-up Feel No Pain helps with its durability. Degrading slower helps with that slightly punishing damage table, keeping it on Ballistic Skill 2+ for a lot longer. And better Overwatch is never a bad thing. Iron Hands also has a ton of extra synergy with vehicles. This thing you're absolutely going to be wanting to put the Iron Stone on, and it could be a good target for some of their stratagems and psychic powers to boost its offense and defense capabilities. Raven Guard or Stealthy could also be great to give it a cover save and make it armor save 2-up anywhere that's outside 12 inches. Ultramarines aren't particularly useful trait-wise, but could combo with something like Tigurius and Cassius to give it an extra -1 to hit every turn, and have the benefit of multiple cheap litanies. Salamanders are always helpful for extra rerolls to hit and wound on the big guns, and some immunity to -1 AP. The Librarian Psychic Powers are also pretty helpful for this. Again, an extra -1 to hit is great, and +1 toughness to make it toughness 10 means you could even have las cannons wounding it on a 5+. Imperial Fist could certainly boost its offensive output through ignores cover, extra shots for those bolters, and an extra pip of damage against vehicles. Black Templars could give it a 4+ invul save for a turn with their Aurelian Shroud relic. Blood Angels could maybe more make use of it as a great big transport to drop some Terminators nearby, or maybe an absolutely enormous squad of Death Company. Dark Angels will certainly enjoy the extra range on its guns, and keep it back out of range of enemy heavies while still being able to shoot them itself, particularly with that Colossal Flyer rule. And also a Dark Shroud will be very handy for an extra -1 to hit on such a big important model. And again, Space Wolves and White Scars might be best off using this thing as a bit of a combat delivery mechanism, albeit a hideously expensive one. In terms of character support, as with a lot of Space Marine Lords of War, they only really start to become anywhere approaching efficient if you stack a lot of character buffs on them. A Captain and Lieutenant for reroll 1s is certainly a great idea. Chaplain Litanies are particularly efficient on this thing as it's such a huge points intensive model, particularly the +1 to hit to keep it accurate despite degrading, and +1 to wound the nearest unit. You could use Might of Heroes with a Librarian to make it toughness 10 if you have a lot of strength 9 firepower in your opponent's army, and you could use a Master of the Forge Tech Marine to make it +1 to hit to counter any modifiers or it being degraded, and also use Tech Marines to stack some extra wounds once it begins to take damage. In terms of stratagems, naturally any unique stratagem that can be used to increase its defensive profile or damage output is going to be a big boon. From the main codex, particularly Armour of Contempt could be used to shrug some mortal wounds. I certainly think about using the command reroll stratagem to give it a second chance to blow up if it's absolutely surrounded by enemy units, as if it does detonate on a 6, then you could potentially get massive amounts of mortal wounds flying all over the enemy's army. To be honest though, if you do lose the Thunderhawk in a 2,000 point game, you might well have just lost the game anyway. So how would I use the Thunderhawk in game? Firstly, I'd take the Hellstrike battery rather than cluster bombs, and I think I'd stick with the Thunderhawk heavy cannon as opposed to the turbo laser destructor of the two, though these ones are a little bit more balanced, depending on what targets you want to take out. In the first turn, if I was going second, I'd certainly want to try and outrange as many enemy guns as possible, which should be made easier with that Colossal Flyer special rule to add 12 inches to their range. Turn 1, I'd certainly think about putting some characters in the place where the Thunderhawk is likely to fly to, so it can fly into the buff aura ranges, rather than having them just start next to it and giving the choice between staying put and losing its hard to hit benefits, or staying with the character bubble. Because it is such an expensive model, the main challenge will be to keep it alive and firing. It really needs to be using all of its guns at full capacity a turn to even begin to justify its very high price tag, but you also need to make sure that it isn't taken out all game long, otherwise you've just lost 3/4 of your army in one shot. To be fair to it, it is fairly hard to gun down. Toughness 9 is a nice bracket to be in. It does have a -1 to hit and a 5+ invul built in, and it does have the capability to outrange quite a lot of long-range enemy guns due to that Colossal Flyer special rule. The downside is that its firepower for the points just isn't really strong enough to be able to chew through any real chunk of the opponent's army, even if it is allowed to fire to full effect for several turns. It's certainly not bad, but you'd be expecting a lot better than not bad for over 1500 points, to be honest. And in most objective-based missions, your opponent will quite happily be able to ignore the Thunderhawk all game long and just capture all the objectives. You'd certainly have to maximise the rest of your force to be able to try and have as much board presence as possible, which isn't going to be the easiest with less than 500 points to play with in your standard 2000 point game. Overall, I think that the Thunderhawk really would need an absolutely enormous points drop for it to start appearing in any sort of competitive game lists. Honestly, I think you could probably cut the points cost of this in half, and that might encourage it to see play. At the moment though, I typically just use a Thunderhawk for fun narrative games, maybe have it taken to the skies in apocalypse games, which I think was where it was mainly intended to be in the first place, to be honest. It'd be interesting to see if Games Workshop does redress the Forge World units as they say they're going to. It'd be nice for this thing to have a little bit more of a reflective points cost of how much it's actually worth, as it certainly is a very iconic and cool looking Space Marine unit. Let me know your thoughts and opinions on the Thunderhawk down in the comments below, and what points you'd put it at if you thought that it would be fairly balanced to see play. If you're interested in seeing more videos like this, we have regular 40k content out every single day, and I'll certainly be continuing to look at the various Space Marine Forge World datasheets as we go along. If you are thinking of buying any 40k or other Warhammer in the near future, hopefully less expensive than the Thunderhawk, then I have a link to Element Games, a UK based discount retailer, in the description below. Any purchases made through that link will send some of the profits to the model sales to this channel without costing you any more yourself, so please consider it if you're thinking about ordering some Warhammer in the UK anytime in the near future. Thanks very much for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.